She sold everything she owned to marry a man she had never met. And when she finally stepped off that train, he laughed in her face. Not privately, not quietly, in front of the entire town. Clara Whitmore had crossed 2,000 miles of this country with nothing but a suitcase, a handful of letters, and the kind of hope that makes a woman do things she can never undo. And in 30 seconds, every single thing she believed about her future died on a dusty platform in Montana. But what happened next? Nobody in Redridge saw coming, not even Clara. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, stay until the end, because this one will stay with you. Redridge, Montana, April 1883. The train announced itself before it arrived. That was the thing about steam locomotives in 1883. They didn't sneak up on a town. They announced themselves from miles out, a low, rolling thunder that built gradually into something that shook the ground beneath your boots and sent birds scattering from fence posts in every direction. By the time the iron engine actually pulled into Redridge Station, half the town had already drifted toward the platform out of nothing more than habit and boredom. Redridge wasn't much to look at in April. The mud season had come and gone, but left its signature on everything. On the storefronts with their peeling paint, on the wooden boardwalks warped from weeks of snowmelt, on the faces of the people who lived there. The mountains to the north still wore their white caps, indifferent and enormous, and the sky above them was the pale, washed-out blue of early spring, a sky that hadn't quite made up its mind yet about being warm. Edwin Hale stood near the far end of the platform with 3 of his friends, and he was already smiling. That smile should have told anyone paying attention something important. It was the kind of smile that exists before the punchline, the smile of a man who already knows how the joke ends. Edwin was 34, broad-shouldered in the way that comes more from money than from work, and he wore his coat like he expected people to notice it. His boots were clean, his hat was new. He had the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life been the person that other people were laughing at. Beside him, Porter Wells was barely containing himself. Wells was the worst of the 3, a cattle broker's son who had grown up watching his father buy and sell things and had drawn the wrong lesson from it, the lesson being that everything in this world had a price and anything without a price was worth nothing at all. He kept elbowing Edwin's arm, kept glancing at the train as it slowed and shuddered, and finally groaned to a stop alongside the platform. "You sure she's on this one?" Wells asked. "I'm sure," Edwin said. "What if she's ugly?" "Doesn't matter." Edwin pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket, a letter, or something that had been a letter once before it became evidence. The deal was, I write her, she comes. Doesn't matter what she looks like. Hargrove bet me $50 she wouldn't actually show. The third man, Hargrove, a thin-faced lawyer from Billings who had ridden out specifically for this, stuffed his hands in his pockets. "I still say no woman is stupid enough to cross the whole country on the strength of 3 letters. "Then you're about to be $50 poorer," Edwin said. They were laughing when the train doors opened. Clara Whitmore was the 4th person off the train. She came down the steps carefully. Her left boot had developed a loose heel somewhere around Nebraska, and she'd spent the last 2 days stepping with a particular kind of caution that she hoped looked like dignity. She was carrying a large leather bag in one hand and her smaller travel case in the other, and she was wearing the green dress she had set aside specifically for this moment. She had pressed it twice in the sleeping car, in the narrow hours before dawn when she couldn't sleep anyway, pressing it with the small iron she'd packed and then hanging it near the window to breathe. She had thought about this moment for 4 months. She had thought about what she would say, whether to smile first or wait for him to smile, whether to put her hand out or let him take the lead. She had rehearsed a dozen versions of it, lying awake in the small bedroom of her family's house in Columbus, Ohio, a house that no longer belonged to her family because she had signed the papers 2 months ago and watched a stranger's name go on the deed. There was no going back. She had understood that clearly when she made the decision. She had said it out loud to herself in the mirror, actually said the words, "There is no going back from this." She had wanted to be honest with herself about the weight of it, what she had not prepared for. What she had failed entirely to imagine in any of her 4 months of rehearsal was laughter. She heard it before she fully understood what she was looking at, a sharp bark of it from somewhere to her right, and then more laughter, cascading, the kind that feeds on itself. She turned toward the sound the way anyone would turn toward something loud and unexpected, and that's when she saw Edwin Hale for the first time. He was looking directly at her. He was pointing at her. "There she is," he said, loudly enough that the words carried clearly down the platform. "My bride." He said the word the way you'd say the setup to a joke. Lord Almighty, she actually came. Wells doubled over. He actually grabbed Edwin's arm to keep from falling. He was laughing so hard. Hargrove had his hand over his mouth, but his shoulders were shaking. Clara stopped walking. Everything around her continued. The train hissed steam. A porter pushed a cart past her. A woman with a small child moved around her on the left. But Clara herself had stopped completely, like something in her had received a signal and simply ceased forward motion. This is a mistake, she thought. This is someone else's moment. I have the wrong platform. But he was still looking at her. He was walking toward her now, still grinning, and behind him his friends were collecting themselves into some rough approximation of composure, except for Wells, who was still making a sound that wasn't quite human. "Clara Whitmore," Edwin said, stopping about 6 feet from her. Not close. Not the distance of a man greeting someone he'd promised to marry. The distance of a man examining something curious. "You really came all this way." "I did," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "You wrote me." "I did write you." He looked back at his friends. Something passed between them, the shared private language of men who find cruelty entertaining. "I wrote you 3 letters." "Yes." "And you sold your house." The words landed like something physical. Clara felt her chin come up slightly, not out of pride exactly, but out of some older reflex, the reflex of a person who has been hit before and learned not to flinch visibly. "I made arrangements," she said carefully. "She made arrangements," Edwin repeated to his friends, and Wells started laughing again. That awful, helpless laugh. And Hargrove was grinning now, and Clara understood in a single, cold, clear moment exactly what had happened to her. The letters hadn't been real. Not real the way she'd understood real. They had been crafted, yes. Edwin Hale was clearly educated enough to write a convincing letter, to describe a ranch and a life, and a loneliness that had sounded genuine enough to move a 26-year-old woman in Ohio to action. But the loneliness had been manufactured. The sincerity had been a performance. She had been a story these men were telling each other over drinks and card games, a wager, a joke with a 2,000-mile setup. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Clara said. She was aware that people on the platform had stopped moving, aware of the watching faces, the careful stillness of strangers witnessing something that made them glad it wasn't them. "No misunderstanding," Edwin said pleasantly. "I wanted to see if you'd actually come. You came." He reached into his coat and produced a small fold of bills. "Porter, pay Hargrove. I told you she'd show." "You're monsters," Clara said quietly. The word came out before she'd decided to say it. It surprised her a little. She hadn't planned to give them anything, any reaction, any fuel, but it was the true word, and it left her mouth without permission. Edwin's smile thinned. Men like Edwin Hale could absorb a lot of things gracefully, but direct moral judgment from a woman they'd publicly humiliated was not one of them. "You might want to watch your mouth," he said. "You're a long way from home." "Yes," Clara said. "I am." That was the moment Porter Wells decided to make it worse. "Sweetheart," he said, stepping forward with that particular swagger of a man who has never once faced a consequence. "Look on the bright side. You're still young enough to find another sucker to take you in. Maybe post a few more letters." He looked her up and down the way you'd look at livestock, though you might want to include a more accurate description of yourself this time. The laughter that followed was the cruelest kind, the kind that comes from an audience enjoying the performance of someone else's pain. Clara felt something close her throat. She would not cry. She made that decision with the deliberate firmness of someone using every ounce of will they possess. She would absolutely not cry on this platform in front of these people. She gripped the handle of her travel case until her knuckles ached, and she stared at a fixed point past Edwin Hale's left shoulder, and she breathed. She didn't hear the footsteps. She didn't see the man until he was already past her. Caleb Mercer had been at the station to pick up a shipment of fence wire, not to witness anyone's humiliation. He had a wagon parked at the end of the platform and a list of hardware supplies from Dawson's that he'd been mentally calculating the cost of for the past 3 days. He was a man with specific and practical concerns, and other people's social dramas ranked very low on his list. But he'd heard Wells's voice from 20 feet away. That voice, that particular note in it, that lazy, comfortable cruelty, was something Caleb's body recognized before his mind had fully processed the words. Something tightened in his chest the way it does when you see a boot raised over something that can't get away. He walked past Clara without stopping. He walked directly up to Porter Wells. Wells was still grinning, turning to receive more validation from his audience, when Caleb hit him. It wasn't a theatrical punch. That's what Clara remembered afterward, in the strange, slow replay of it. It wasn't the kind of punch from a story, wide and arcing and announced. It was economical. One movement. Wells's head snapped sideways and he went down between the platform boards and the train car like a coat falling off a hook, boneless and sudden. And then he was sitting on the platform looking up at the sky with an expression of total bewilderment, blood on his lip. The crowd on the platform went absolutely silent. Edwin Hale took a step back. Hargrove took two. Caleb Mercer stood over Wells and didn't say anything for a moment. He was tall, not in the theatrical way, not the kind of tall that announces itself, but the kind of tall that you notice when he's standing close and you realize you have to look up. His coat was worn at the elbows, and his hat had lost its shape some years ago. There was dirt on his boots that had not been put there by decorative intent. "You want to get up and keep going," Caleb said to Wells. "That's your right." Wells blinked at him, decided against it. Caleb turned then, and for the first time Clara saw his face properly. He was perhaps 32, 33, with the kind of features that outdoor life made into a kind of map. Lines at the corners of his eyes that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with squinting into wind. A jaw that looked like it had been assembled with function rather than aesthetics in mind. He wasn't handsome the way Edwin Hale was handsome. He was something less polished and more real. He looked at Clara directly and without pity, which was the most surprising thing. Every other face on that platform was looking at her with some version of pity. The soft, slightly horrified pity of people watching a disaster they can't help. Caleb Mercer looked at her the way you'd look at another person during a shared difficulty. Level. Acknowledging. "You have a place to stay?" he asked. Clara blinked. No, I had arranged." She stopped. The arrangements she had made had assumed the existence of a man who did not exist. "No," she said simply. Caleb nodded once, like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. He glanced at her bags. "My wagon's at the end of the platform," he said. "I have a ranch 12 miles north. I have a spare room." He paused. "You don't know me. I understand that. I'm Caleb Mercer. I've been in Red Ridge 11 years. Dorothy Huang at the post office knows me. So does Judge Ames if you need a character reference. You can ask anyone here." He said it matter-of-factly, the way a man gives directions. No flourish, no particular warmth, nothing that asked her to feel anything about it. "Why?" Clara asked. The question hung there. She needed to ask it. She had just come from a situation that had been built entirely on a false premise, and she was in no condition to take anything at face value. Caleb considered this for a moment. He looked like a man who was used to considering things before he spoke, which was already different from most of the men she had encountered in the last 10 minutes. "Because somebody should have," he said. He picked up the larger of her bags without asking, not with a flourish, but with the same practical efficiency he might have used loading the fence wire, and started walking toward the end of the platform. Clara stood holding her smaller case. Edwin Hale and his friends had retreated toward the station entrance, Wells being helped to his feet by Hargrove, nobody looking at her anymore. The crowd on the platform was starting to disperse with that particular speed of people who have witnessed something uncomfortable and are eager to reclassify it as not their business. Clara looked at the direction Caleb had gone. She looked back at the train, already being serviced, men moving along the cars with intention and purpose, the whole mechanical business of departure beginning. There was nothing on that train for her. Columbus was nothing but an empty house with someone else's name on the deed. She picked up her case and walked after Caleb Mercer. The wagon was a working wagon, which is to say it was not comfortable and had not been designed with any consideration for comfort. There was a board across the front that served as a seat, and behind it the wagon bed held a collection of tools and ropes and things Clara could not immediately identify. The horse, A large, dark animal with a philosophical expression stood waiting with the patience of a creature that has accepted its situation. Caleb loaded her bag into the wagon bed without ceremony and climbed onto the seat and waited. Clara climbed up on the other side, which took more effort than she wanted it to given the height of the wagon and the state of her boots, and arranged herself on the board seat and said nothing. They pulled out of Red Ridge in silence. The silence lasted perhaps 2 miles, through the end of town and onto the wider track heading north, with the mountains growing steadily clearer ahead of them. Clara watched the landscape change, the scrubby buildings giving way to open land, the open land giving way to the first real suggestion of wilderness, the kind that didn't soften itself for anyone. The sky had clouded slightly since the morning, and the air smelled of something that might later become rain. "You don't have to stay," Caleb said eventually. He was looking at the road ahead. "I want to be clear about that. The room is yours as long as you need it, but you're not obligated to anything." "I understand that," Clara said. "There's a position open at the schoolhouse in Red Ridge. Mrs. Calloway mentioned it to me last week. If you have teaching experience." Clara looked at him. "How do you know I have teaching experience?" He glanced at her briefly. "I don't. I'm asking." "I do," she said. 6 years. Back in Ohio." He nodded like this was useful information filed in the appropriate place. "The ranch is not a hotel," he continued. "There's work that needs doing every day, and I'm one person doing it. I'm not asking you to contribute. I'm just telling you what the place is." "I'm not afraid of work." "I didn't think you were," he said, and that was the end of that particular conversation. Clara turned and looked back once, though she didn't know why. Red Ridge had disappeared behind a long rise in the land. There was nothing to see but the road they had already traveled. She faced forward again. The mountains ahead were enormous and cold, and did not care about her at all, which was, in its own strange way, a relief. The land out here had no opinion about what had happened to her on that platform. The land had not watched and whispered. The land had not laughed. She gripped the edge of the wagon seat as it swayed over a rut, and adjusted her weight, and breathed the cold mountain air, and thought, "All right then, all right." Not with hope, exactly. She was not in the condition for hope, but with something, some small, stubborn, undefeated thing that had survived the platform and the laughter and the 2,000-mile unraveling of everything she had planned, and that was still, despite all of it, breathing. The wagon rolled north. The mountains waited. The ranch appeared after a descent through a stand of pine trees that broke suddenly onto a wide open valley, and Clara's first thought, the honest one, before she had time to compose a more dignified reaction, was that it was the loneliest place she had ever seen. The main house was long and low, built from timber that had weathered to the color of old pewter. A covered porch ran the length of the front, and one of the porch boards was visibly broken, the end of it tilted up slightly like a small complaint. There was a barn behind the house, larger than the house itself, and a fence line running off to the east that disappeared into the grass. A kitchen garden existed in theory on the south side of the house. Clara could see the rough rectangle of it, mostly overtaken by last year's growth. A dog materialized from somewhere and barked twice at the wagon, then approached and sniffed Caleb's boot when he climbed down, and wagged once, a single, restrained wag, as if the dog had learned its habits from its owner. "That's Bern," Caleb said. "Hello, Bern," Clara said from the wagon. Bern regarded her without warmth but without hostility, which she decided to take as a reasonable beginning. Caleb carried her bags to the house and showed her the spare room. It was small. It had a window facing east, a wooden bed frame with a rope mattress, a washstand, and a hook on the door for hanging things. The floor was uneven, and one corner of the ceiling had a water stain in the shape of something she couldn't quite identify. "There are extra blankets in the chest," Caleb said from the doorway. He did not come fully into the room. "Outhouse is around the back. I'll have supper in about 2 hours." He paused. "If you want it." "I want it," Clara said. He nodded and left. Clara set down her travel case and sat on the edge of the bed and listened to the ranch sounds. The wind finding the gaps in the walls, the horses in the barn shifting their weight, Bern's nails on the porch outside. Far off, a bird called once and was quiet. She had sold her family home for this. She had crossed a continent for a man who thought she was a punchline, and she had ended up in a stranger's spare room in the Montana wilderness, with a broken porch board and a dog who had given her one reluctant wag. She put her hands over her face. She didn't cry. She had promised herself, and she kept the promise. But she pressed her palms against her eyes until she saw color, and she breathed very carefully, and she let the thing that needed to move through her, and then she straightened up and looked at the water stain on the ceiling. Outside the window, the mountains stood where they had always stood, enormous and permanent and utterly unmoved by any of it. After a while, Clara got up and began to unpack. The first morning at the Mercer Ranch arrived without ceremony. Clara woke before the light did, which surprised her. She had expected to sleep badly and had in fact slept badly, but her body had made the decision to be awake at 4:30 regardless. And once she was awake, there was no negotiating with it. She lay in the dark listening to the ranch settle around her. The walls made small sounds. The wind outside had picked up in the night and was now testing the window frame with a kind of persistent, methodical pressure. And somewhere in the barn, a horse stamped once, then was quiet. She dressed in the dark and sat on the edge of the bed and took inventory. This was something she had done since she was a girl. Her mother had called it counting your coins, meaning you sit down and you figure out exactly what you have before you decide what to do with it. Clara had done it the morning her father died. She had done it the morning she signed the house papers in Columbus. She did it now, in a stranger's spare room in Montana, with the window showing nothing but a rectangle of cold, dark sky. What she had, 2 dresses besides the green one, 3 changes of underclothes, her mother's tortoiseshell comb, $11.40 in a cloth purse at the bottom of her travel case, her teaching certificate rolled in oilskin, and the ability to do what needed doing without being told twice. What she did not have: a plan, a home, a return ticket, or anyone in this territory who owed her anything. She heard Caleb moving before she heard him directly. First the creak of floorboards in the main part of the house, then the particular sound of a cast-iron stove being woken up, the metal clank of it, the scrape. She waited a few minutes, then she got up, took her coat from the hook, and went out. The kitchen was already lit by the time she reached it. Caleb was at the stove with his back to her, and he had the practiced economy of movement of someone who has made coffee alone in the dark so many mornings it no longer requires thought. He heard her come in, she was sure of that, but he didn't turn around. "Coffee's almost ready," he said. "Thank you." She found a chair at the table and sat in it, and that was how the first morning began. Not with conversation, not with the careful politeness of strangers trying to establish rules, just with coffee and the sound of wind and the gradual gray arrival of light through the kitchen window. It was Caleb who spoke first, eventually. He set a cup in front of her and sat across the table and wrapped both hands around his own cup and looked at it for a moment. "I need to ride the fence line today," he said. "East pasture. I've been putting it off, and I can't put it off anymore." "All right," Claire said. "I'll be back by dark." He paused. "There's food in the larder. Help yourself to whatever's there." Another pause. "The porch board. The broken one. There's a loose nail. I'd stay off that end if I were you." "I noticed it," she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. Outside, Byrne made a sound on the porch. Not quite a bark, more of a commentary, and then was quiet again. "Mr. Mercer," Claire said. He looked at her. He had the kind of eyes that were difficult to read, not because they concealed things, but because they were simply direct. And directness, she was finding, was something she was out of practice receiving. "I want to contribute," she said. "While I'm here. I'm not a guest, and I don't intend to sit in that room while you work." She put her hands flat on the table. "I can cook and I can clean, and I'm not delicate. Tell me what needs doing." Caleb looked at her hands on the table, then he looked at her face. Whatever he was measuring, he seemed to arrive at a number. "Kitchen garden," he said. "It's been let go. I don't have time for it." He said this without apology, as a statement of fact about his situation. "If you're willing," "I'm willing." "Tools are in the lean-to beside the barn." And that was the whole negotiation. No speech about terms, no catalog of expectations, just the garden and the tools and the lean-to beside the barn. Clara drank the rest of her coffee. It was, she thought, the most honest conversation she had had in months. The kitchen garden was worse than it had looked from the wagon. Up close, in the morning light, It was a tangle of dead stalks from the previous season, matted together with new spring weeds that had moved in with the particular confidence of things that grow where they haven't been invited. The soil underneath, when she managed to work down to it, was packed in gray and had the exhausted quality of earth that had been asked too much of and given nothing back. Clara worked through the morning with a hoe and a spade and her own 2 hands. She worked methodically, which was the only way she knew how to work, left to right, section by section, clearing as she went. It was hard labor, and she was not used to hard labor in this particular form. And by mid-morning, she had a blister starting on her right palm, and her back was registering a formal complaint. She kept going. There was something in the physicality of it that she needed, though she couldn't have articulated exactly why. The dirt under her fingernails, the ache of it, the visible progress of cleared ground. It was evidence, maybe. Evidence that she was here, that she was doing something real, that yesterday had happened, and she had survived it, and was now standing in a kitchen garden in Montana with sore hands, which was not nothing. Byrne watched her from a safe distance for about an hour, then apparently decided she wasn't going to do anything interesting and went away. She found 2 ceramic pots in the lean-to that she moved to the garden to collect the pulled weeds. She found a watering can with a rusted bottom that she decided she could address later. She found, under a collapsed section of the garden fence, a rose bush that was not dead. Emphatically not dead, in fact, since it had put out 3 small leaves with the stubborn insistence of something that had decided not to ask permission. She spent 15 minutes carefully untangling the rose bush from the collapsed fence, and then she wasn't sure what to do with it, so she set it carefully to one side. By noon, she had cleared half the garden. She went inside and made herself a meal from what was in the larder. There was hardtack and dried beans and a tin of peaches and a side of salted pork hanging that she didn't touch because it was more than she needed. And she ate at the kitchen table and looked out the window at the mountains and thought about Edwin Hale's face. Not with grief. That surprised her. She had expected grief or something like it. She had expected the particular hollow feeling of a future that has been taken away, the way you'd feel losing a house to fire. But what she actually felt when she thought about Edwin's face was anger, and the anger had a clean quality to it, almost useful, like a tool she had not known she possessed. She was still thinking about this when she heard the wagon. It wasn't Caleb, too early, and the sound was wrong. This was a lighter rig, moving fast up the track, and it stopped at the front of the house. Clara went to the window. The woman climbing down from the buggy was perhaps 50, with the build of someone who had never been particularly interested in looking fragile and the expression of someone arriving with specific purpose. She was carrying a basket covered with a cloth, and she moved toward the house with the confidence of someone who had been here before. Clara opened the door before she knocked. The woman stopped, looked at Clara's dirt-covered hands and the state of her apron and the general fact of her existence in this doorway. "Well," the woman said, "you're the one from the train station." "I am," Clara said. "Margaret Ellison." She held out her hand, the hand that wasn't holding the basket. And Clara shook it. Her grip was businesslike. "I have the homestead 2 miles east. I heard what happened yesterday." She paused. "Most of Redridge heard what happened yesterday, if I'm being truthful." Clara stepped back from the door. "Do you want to come in?" Margaret Ellison came in. She set her basket on the kitchen table and removed the cloth from it to reveal a bread loaf, a jar of preserves, and something wrapped in paper that turned out to be cold chicken. "I'm not here to pity you," Margaret said, sitting down in the chair across from where Clara sat, the same chair Caleb had used that morning. "I want to say that first. I'm not that kind of neighbor." "I appreciate that," Clara said. "Edwin Hale is a particular kind of fool," Margaret said. "The kind that's been told he's charming for so long he confused it with being decent." She smoothed her skirt over her knees. "Porter Wells is worse. His father at least had the decency to be straightforwardly greedy about it. Porter does it for amusement." She shook her head. "But that's Red Ridge for you. Certain men in this town have been running it like a private game for 20 years and nobody's done much about it." "Caleb Mercer did something about it," Clara said. Margaret looked at her steadily. "Yes, he did." She said it with a weight that suggested the words meant something beyond their surface, though she didn't elaborate. "How are you finding the place?" "I've been working the kitchen garden." Margaret glanced toward the window, toward the garden. "Caleb hasn't touched that garden since Ellen passed." She said it simply, without drama, Just information delivered in the way of a woman who sees no benefit in dancing around a thing. Clara processed this carefully. Ellen? His wife. Margaret picked at a loose thread on her cuff. 3 years ago. Fever, late winter. It was quick, which people say like it's a mercy. She shrugged slightly. I'm not sure it is. Quick doesn't mean it leaves less behind. Clara looked at the kitchen, re-looking at it now with this new information. The practical bareness of it, the absence of the small accumulations that women bring to a space, the sense she'd had since last night of a house where someone had been careful to stop adding things. He didn't tell me, Clara said. No, he wouldn't. Margaret stood and retied the cloth over the basket slightly more neatly than she'd untied it, a habitual gesture. He doesn't talk about Ellen to people he doesn't know. He doesn't talk about much at all to people he doesn't know. She paused. He's a good man, Clara. There aren't as many of those out here as there ought to be, so I'll say it plainly. He's a good man, and what he did at the station yesterday was not nothing. This is not a town where men generally interfere in other men's business. Why did he? Clara asked. I asked him. He said, because somebody should have, Margaret finished. She smiled slightly. Yes, that sounds right. She picked up her basket. I'll come again next week. The bread is better the second day if you can leave it. She left the way she had come. Direct, efficient, without fuss. Clara heard the buggy moving back down the track, and then the sound faded into the general quiet of the valley, and she sat at the kitchen table for a moment with the bread loaf and the preserves and the cold chicken and the information she'd been given, and the question she now had that she hadn't had before. She looked at the kitchen again, at the bare hooks on the wall, at the single coffee cup still on the counter from that morning, Caleb's sitting by the dry sink where he'd left it. She got up and washed both cups. Caleb came back at dusk, as he'd said. He came through the back door and stopped in the doorway of the kitchen because the kitchen was different. Not dramatically different, but the food was warm and there was a smell in the room that hadn't been there this morning, and the table had been cleared and set. He stood in the doorway for just a moment longer than necessary. Margaret Ellison came by, Clara said, at the stove. She brought chicken. I made a stew from it. You didn't have to do that, he said. I wanted to eat hot food, she said, which was true. There's enough for two. He washed up at the sink without being asked, which she noted, and sat at the table, and she served the stew from the pot she'd found in the lower cabinet, and they sat and ate. It wasn't comfortable exactly. It was two people who didn't know each other sitting in a kitchen in the mountains eating stew. But it wasn't uncomfortable either, which was its own thing worth noting. The east fence? She asked. 3 sections needed replacing, he said. Took longer than I thought. He broke a piece of Margaret's bread. Garden looks better. I got through half of it. The soil needs amending. There's a manure pile behind the barn. He paused. Old. Broken down enough to use. I'll start on the other half tomorrow. He looked up from his bowl briefly. You don't have to. You said that this morning too, Clara said. About the stew. I'm noticing you say that a lot. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one. Habit, he said. Of living alone, Clara said. Not cruelly, just accurately. He looked at her. Yes. They ate the rest of the meal without talking much, but the silence had changed its character since that morning. It was less careful, somehow, less provisional. After supper, Caleb sat on the porch with a pipe he didn't fully light, just held, and Clara sat in the chair at the other end with a mending project she'd found in her case, a hem that had needed fixing for 3 weeks. The mountains to the north had gone from purple to black against a sky that was filling with stars at a rate that didn't seem real to someone who had spent the last 6 years in an Ohio city where stars were suggestions rather than facts. Margaret told me about your wife, Clara said. She said it without apology because she'd decided that she would rather be direct than careful, and because she thought he was probably a man who preferred it. Caleb was quiet for a moment. The unlit pipe moved in his hand. Ellen, he said. Yes. 3 years in April. He said it like a date on a calendar. She would have been 31 this summer. Clara kept her eyes on the mending. I'm sorry. You didn't know her. No, but I'm sorry anyway. He looked out at the dark valley. The wind had died and the air was cold and clean, the kind of cold that feels like a fact rather than a complaint. Byrne had settled between their chairs and was doing the slow, purposeful work of going to sleep. "She planted that rose bush," Caleb said. "The one in the garden." Clara's needle stopped. "I found it under the collapsed fencing. I set it to one side. I wasn't sure." "It's fine," he said. "I should have dealt with the fence before now." He paused. "She was always after me about that garden. Said I built the fence too close to the north side and the shade was killing half of it." A beat. "She was right." Clara said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to that, and she'd learned long ago that the impulse to say something useful in the face of grief was mostly about the speaker's discomfort rather than the grieving person's need. They sat in the quiet. After a while, Caleb stood and knocked the cold tobacco out of his pipe on the porch rail and said goodnight in a voice that sounded like a man who had said more this evening than he usually said and wasn't sure yet how he felt about it. His boots moved across the porch. The front door opened and closed. Clara folded her mending and looked at the stars for another few minutes. She thought about Edwin Hale and the way the laughter had sounded and how far she'd come and what she'd arrived at. She thought about Margaret Ellison saying he's a good man with that particular weight, the weight of a scarce thing being accurately named. She thought about the rose bush with its 3 stubborn leaves putting itself out under a collapsed fence in ground that nobody had been tending, in a season that wasn't even fully warm yet. She went inside. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in the dark and listened to the ranch, which had its own vocabulary of sounds that she was beginning, very slightly, to learn. The particular creak of the second floorboard in the hallway. The barn settling. Byrne relocating himself somewhere outside with a series of small shifts and sighs. Somewhere far out in the dark, a coyote called, a long, ascending sound that seemed to ask something of the dark and receive no answer. Clara put her arm over her eyes and lay still. Tomorrow there was the other half of the garden. There was the soil that needed amending and the fence that needed fixing and $11.40 in a cloth purse and a teaching certificate in oilskin and whatever came after that. She did not know yet what came after that. But the ranch was quiet around her, and the stars were doing their work outside the window, and she was still here, which was not nothing. She closed her eyes. 2 weeks passed the way early spring passes in Montana. Not gently, not with any particular grace, but with a kind of relentless forward motion that didn't ask your permission. The snow came back once, briefly, a late-season reminder that the mountains made their own rules, and then it was gone, and the ground was muddy again, and the sky returned to that pale, determined blue. Clara had settled into the ranch the way water settles into a new container, not because the container was designed for it, but because water finds the available space and occupies it. She woke early. She worked the garden. She cooked in the evenings. She mended things that needed mending and swept floors that needed sweeping and noted, without comment, the various small repairs the house required. A hinge on the kitchen cabinet that had given up its lower screw, a gap under the back door that let in a persistent cold draft, the broken porch board that she had stepped around 11 times before she found the hammer in the lean-to and fixed it herself one afternoon. Caleb came home from that day's work to find her crouched on the porch with the hammer, fitting a new section of board she'd cut from a leftover plank she'd found stacked against the barn wall. He stood at the bottom of the porch steps and watched her work for a moment. "The cut's a little short on the left end," he said. "I know," Clara said, not looking up. "I'll fill it. It won't move." He stood there another moment. Then he went inside. That was how most of their exchanges went. Practical, brief, functional. They had developed a household rhythm that neither of them had designed, that had simply assembled itself out of the necessities of daily life on an isolated ranch. Caleb handled the animals, the fences, the larger physical work of the land. Clara handled the house and the garden and the cooking. Nobody had proposed this division. It had arrived on its own, the way most practical arrangements do, and both of them had simply followed where it led without making a ceremony of it. But underneath the practicality, something else was happening, slower and less visible, the way things grow underground before they surface. It was the conversations after supper that did it. They had begun the first night with Ellen's name and the rose bush, and they had continued, not every night, not with any forced consistency, but often enough that Clara had started to expect them. She would finish washing up, and he would be on the porch with his pipe, and she would bring her mending or just her hands and sit at the other end, and they would talk or they wouldn't, depending on the night. She learned things about him in the way you learn a landscape, not all at once, but gradually, as the light changes and reveals different features. She learned that he had come to Montana from Tennessee at 21, following an older brother who had died of a riding accident 2 years after arriving, which meant Caleb had stayed not out of choice exactly, but because leaving felt like abandoning the grave. She learned that he had built most of the ranch house himself, which explained its solidity and its imperfections in roughly equal measure. She learned that he had opinions about horses that he would articulate at length if asked, and opinions about most other things that he kept considerably more guarded. She learned that he missed Ellen in the way that doesn't announce itself. Not in grief that surfaced dramatically, but in the small vacant spaces in a life built for two. The second coffee cup he no longer automatically reached for. The chair on the left side of the porch that had acquired a fine layer of dust because nobody sat in it. The habit he had of beginning a sentence with we and then catching himself and correcting it to I with a pause so slight that most people probably never noticed it. Clara noticed it. On the 14th day, she walked to Red Ridge. Caleb had offered to take her in the wagon when he went for supplies, but she had said no. She wanted to go herself. And the look he gave her carried a question he didn't ask out loud. She understood the question. Red Ridge was where the platform was, where Edwin Hale's friends drank, where people had watched and whispered. She understood that going back there was a thing that required something from her that she hadn't been sure she had. But she needed to speak with Mrs. Calloway about the teaching position, and she needed to do it on her own 2 feet. The walk was 4 miles on the main track, then 2 more into town, and she did it in just over an hour. Red Ridge in the morning was quieter than it had been on the day of her arrival. The platform empty now, just the ordinary business of a small frontier town going about itself. She was aware of being looked at. She was aware of the recognition in certain faces. The station master, a woman outside the dry goods store who paused fractionally too long before moving on. She kept her chin level and kept walking. Mrs. Calloway ran the schoolhouse from a small office attached to the building's east side, a room barely large enough for a desk and 2 chairs, and the particular organized chaos of a woman managing more than one job at a time. She was perhaps 45, with spectacles and the focused energy of someone who had decided early in life that there was too much to do to waste time performing anything. "Miss Whitmore," she said when Clara appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been expecting her, which meant Margaret Ellison had said something, which didn't surprise Clara at all. "Mrs. Calloway, I understand there's a teaching position." "Sit down." Mrs. Calloway moved papers from the second chair to the desk in a single sweeping gesture. "The previous teacher left in February. His wife's family in St. Louis had a crisis of some sort, and they haven't come back. I've been teaching both grades myself since then, and I'll tell you plainly that I cannot continue doing it." She looked at Clara over her spectacles. "You have a certificate?" 6 years in Columbus. I have the certificate." "Younger grades or older?" "Both at different points. I prefer the younger ones. They're more honest about what they don't understand." Mrs. Calloway smiled at this briefly. "The position pays $14 a month. It includes the use of the small house at the south end of town. Nothing grand, but it's livable, and it's yours as long as you're teaching." She folded her hands. "I'll be direct with you. There are people in this town who will have opinions about hiring a woman who arrived the way you arrived. I want you to know that I am not one of those people, and the school board will follow my recommendation, but you should be prepared for the opinions." "I have experience with other people's opinions," Clara said. "Yes? I imagine you do." Mrs. Calloway picked up a pen, considered it, set it down again. "I also want to say, what happened at the station? Edwin Hale is a man who has used this town as his personal parlor for a long time. What he did to you was not exceptional for him. It was just the first time he did it to someone who hadn't yet learned to expect it." The words landed with a specific kind of weight. Clara looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. "When can I start?" she asked. "Monday," Mrs. Calloway said. "If you want it." "I want it," Clara said. She was back on the track heading north by 10 in the morning, moving faster than she'd come. The mountains ahead were sharp against the sky, and the air smelled of pine resin and cold water, and the first real warmth of the year working its way up from the south. She was not happy, exactly. Happiness felt like too uncomplicated a word for what was happening in her chest. But she was something. She was the thing that comes after surviving the worst day and finding out, incrementally, that there is more afterward. She didn't tell Caleb about the teaching position that evening. She sat with it herself for the night, the way you keep a piece of important news close before you speak it out loud. Because once you say it, the shape of it changes and belongs partly to someone else. She told him the next morning at the kitchen table, over coffee. He was quiet for a moment after she said it. He was looking at his cup. "The house on the south end," he said. "Yes." Another pause. "That's a reasonable arrangement," he said carefully. The word reasonable carried some complicated weight that Clara heard but didn't address directly. "I can stay through the end of this week," she said. "Give you time to..." She stopped. She wasn't sure what she was giving him time for exactly. "You don't have to rush," he said. "I know." He got up and put his cup at the dry sink and got his coat from the hook. At the door he stopped, which was unusual. He usually just went. "The school on the south end," he said, without turning around. "That's 2 miles from the north gate." Clara waited. "The track gets bad in mud season," he said. "Ruts. If you need a ride into town or back, I go that direction most Saturdays for supplies." He opened the door and went out. Clara sat at the table and looked at the place where he'd been standing and thought about what had just happened, which was that Caleb Mercer had offered her something in the most indirect way it was possible to offer a thing, wrapped in weather information and stated as a practical observation about road conditions. She smiled, which was the first time she had smiled, actually smiled, since the train. It felt strange on her face, like a muscle that had forgotten its purpose and was trying to remember. She was still sitting there when the trouble arrived. She heard horses first, more than one, moving fast, the confident speed of men who aren't asking the road's permission. She went to the window and saw 2 riders coming up the track, and even at a distance, even before she could see faces, something in her body recognized the posture of Porter Wells. She went to the back door and called out toward the barn. "Caleb!" He appeared from the barn doorway. He saw the riders. His face didn't change exactly, but something in him went very still, the way an animal goes still before it decides whether to move or hold ground. Wells pulled up at the front fence with the practiced ease of a man who has spent his whole life arriving places on horseback and expecting doors to open. The other rider was a man Clara didn't recognize, broader, with a face that looked like it had conducted several business negotiations with the wrong end of a fist. Wells's lip had healed mostly. He was wearing it with a certain careful set to his jaw that suggested it still ached if he moved his mouth wrong, which Clara privately found appropriate. "Mercer," Wells said. Caleb came around the side of the house. He stopped near the porch steps. He didn't say anything. "I want to talk to you," Wells said. "You're talking," Caleb said. Wells glanced at Clara, who was standing in the doorway. His expression did something she couldn't quite categorize. Not embarrassment, nothing that honorable. Something closer to the recalibration of a man who had expected a different situation and was adjusting. "Privately," Wells said. "I don't have private business with you," Caleb said. Wells shifted in the saddle. The broad man beside him was watching Caleb with the specific professional attention of someone being paid to watch. "That thing at the station," Wells said, and his voice had changed slightly, less of the easy drawing room quality, something harder underneath it. "That was a public incident. You hit a man in front of witnesses." "I did," Caleb said. "Edwin is prepared to let it go," Wells said, "as a professional courtesy, given that you and him have had dealings over the years." "Edwin doesn't need to let anything go," Caleb said. "If he wants to bring a complaint to Judge Ames about a man hitting another man who was insulting a woman in public, he's welcome to do that." Something tightened around Wells's eyes. "That's not the spirit in which this visit was intended." "What spirit was it intended in?" Wells glanced at Clara again. "The woman needs to move on," he said. "She came here under false pretenses." "She came here because your friend wrote her letters," Caleb said. His voice hadn't risen. That was the thing about it. It stayed entirely level, which somehow made it worse. "That's not a false pretense on her end." "She has no business here," Wells said, and now the smoothness was fully gone. Now it was just the hard thing underneath. "She has no family, no claim, no position in this town. The longer she stays, the more of an embarrassment she is to people who—" "To Edwin," Clara said from the doorway. Both men looked at her. She had not intended to speak, but the sentence had required finishing. "To Edwin," she said again, clearly. You mean the longer I stay, the more people remember what he did. The more it sits there in the middle of Redridge where nobody can pretend they didn't see it. Wells looked at her the way a man looks at something that has stepped out of the category he put it in. You should be careful, he said. Of what? Clara said. You've already done the worst thing you could do to me. You did it 3 weeks ago on a train platform in front of 50 people. What exactly is left? The broad man shifted slightly in his saddle, and Wells put a hand out to stop whatever he was about to do. Caleb had moved. Clara hadn't seen him move, but he had closed the distance between himself and the front fence without appearing to walk there, and he was now standing close enough to Wells's horse that the horse noticed and adjusted. You should go, Caleb said to Wells. Quiet. Final. The tone of a statement rather than a request. Wells held the eye contact for a moment, the duration of a man measuring what he's willing to risk. Then he reined his horse around, and the broad man followed, and they went back down the track at a canter, not quite fast enough to look like fleeing, but fast enough to look like leaving before they were made to. Clara released a breath she'd been holding. Caleb stood at the fence a moment longer, watching the track even after they'd gone. Then he turned and came up to the porch and stopped at the bottom of the steps and looked at her. You all right? He asked. Yes. She considered this. That was about Edwin's reputation, she said. Not about me at all, really. Just about the fact that I'm still here. Yes, Caleb said. So the longer I stay, the more it bothers him, Caleb said. Yes. They looked at each other. In the space between them, something unspoken moved. Something that was partly about Wells and Edwin and partly not about them at all. I accepted the teaching position, Clara said. I'm not leaving because Porter Wells rides up a track and uses a threatening voice. I didn't think you were, Caleb said. I just want that to be clear. It's clear, he said. He went back to the barn. Clara stayed in the doorway for a moment, looking down the empty track where Wells had gone, and then she looked at the mountains, which were doing what they always did, standing there, enormous and uninvested, keeping their own counsel. She went inside and started on the bread. That night on the porch, the air had the sharp clarity that comes after tension passes, the way the air clears after a storm. Caleb was quiet in a different way than usual, not the quiet of a man conserving words, but the quiet of one sitting with something. He'll come back, Caleb said. Not him personally. Edwin will find another way to make things difficult. I know, Clara said. The town will take sides, he said. It always does out here, and Edwin has more money than most. I know that too. He looked at her, and in the dark his face was difficult to read, which was usually the case and usually suited him fine, but tonight it seemed to cost him something. Why aren't you afraid? He asked. Not critically, genuinely. Clara thought about it honestly. I am afraid, she said. I've been afraid since I stepped off that train. I'm afraid right now, if I'm being truthful. She smoothed her hands over her skirt, but I found that being afraid and going ahead anyway takes about the same amount of energy as being afraid and not going. You pay the cost either way. Might as well go. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Ellen used to say something like that, he said. Different words, same idea. It was the first time he had offered that comparison freely, without Clara providing the opening for it. She didn't respond immediately because she understood what it had cost him to say it, even said that plainly. She just sat with it. Byrne had settled between their chairs again, doing his slow collapse into sleep. The stars were extraordinary, the way they got on clear, cold nights. Not scattered, but layered, depth behind depth, the kind of sky that makes Ohio feel like a different planet. She sounds like she was someone worth knowing, Clara said finally. She was, Caleb said. They sat there until the cold drove them inside. Clara took her mending, and he took his pipe, and neither of them said goodnight in any formal way. They simply moved inside at roughly the same moment, the way people do when they've been in the same space long enough that they've begun to breathe at the same rhythm without noticing. Clara lay in the dark and thought about Monday and the schoolhouse, and Mrs. Calloway, and $14 a month, and a small house on the south end of town that would be hers. She thought about Porter Wells's face and the careful stillness of Caleb at the fence. She thought about being afraid and going anyway. She thought about the rosebush, which she had replanted in a better section of the garden on the south side where the light was good, well away from the fence. She had packed the soil around its roots and watered it, and then felt slightly ridiculous doing something so deliberate for a plant. But it had seemed right. It seemed like the thing to do for something that had survived being buried under a collapsed fence and was still putting out leaves. She closed her eyes. Outside, the coyote called again, that same ascending note, that same unanswered question sent out into the dark. This time, Clara thought she understood it a little better. She moved into the South End house on a Saturday. It wasn't much of a moving. She had arrived in Montana with 2 bags and had acquired nothing since, so the process took less than an hour. Caleb drove her in the wagon, as he'd offered, and helped carry her things inside without making any particular ceremony of it. The house was small and square, with 2 rooms and a kitchen alcove, and a window in the main room that faced west toward the mountains. Someone had left a table and 2 chairs. There was a cast-iron stove in the corner that looked functional. The floor was uneven in the same way the ranch house floor was uneven, as if all the builders in this territory had learned their craft from the same slightly imprecise teacher. Caleb set her bags down in the main room and looked around the space with the assessing expression of a man noting structural details. "Stovepipe needs cleaning," he said. "I can see that. The latch on the back window is broken." He tested it with 2 fingers. "I can fix that before I go." "You don't have to." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I'll fix it before I go." He did fix it. He had brought a small kit of tools in the wagon, which she noticed and did not comment on. And then he stood in the doorway of the main room with his hat in his hands, which was the first time she had seen him hold his hat rather than wear it. And he looked like a man who had come to the end of a prepared list and found himself with nothing left to do. "Saturday," he said. "I come for supplies most Saturdays." "You mentioned that," Clara said. "Right." He put his hat back on. "The track north of the mill gets muddy after rain." "Caleb," she said. He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." She didn't elaborate because elaboration would have made it smaller somehow, would have broken it down into components when what she wanted to say was the whole of it. The spare room, the coffee in the dark, the porch conversations, the fence, the way he had stood at the front gate when Wells came and had not once asked her to make herself less visible to make things easier. He looked at her with those direct eyes, and for a moment something in his face was just present, not guarded, not managed, just the face of a man receiving something real. "You'll be all right here," he said. It came out like a statement of fact rather than reassurance, which was somehow more convincing than reassurance would have been. Then he went out, and she heard the wagon, and then the wagon was gone. Clara stood in the middle of her 2-room house with the mountains in the window and her 2 bags on the floor, and she thought, all right, this is what's next. She started cleaning the stovepipe. Monday arrived with the particular severity of a first day. Clara was at the schoolhouse before Mrs. Calloway, which she'd intended. She wanted to see the room alone first, before the children came, before anyone came. She stood in the center of the classroom with the morning light coming through the east-facing windows and counted the desks. 14, arranged in 2 rough rows, a blackboard at the front with the previous teacher's last lesson still ghosted on it in chalk, a multiplication problem, abandoned mid-solution, a bookshelf on the north wall with perhaps 30 volumes, some of which she could tell from across the room were falling apart. She spent an hour before the children arrived. She erased the abandoned multiplication problem. She reorganized the bookshelf. She found chalk dust everywhere and cleaned it with a rag she'd brought from the house. The children came in 1s and 2s, age ranging from 6 to 13, the older ones already wearing the territorial wariness of people who had been told things about her. She saw it in 2 of the older boys especially, the sideways looks, the deliberate small disruptions of sitting down, the kind of low-grade testing that children conduct when they want to determine whether an adult is real or performance. Clara looked at the older boy, a 13-year-old named Tom Briggs with the stubborn jaw of someone who'd learned defensiveness early, and said, "You're in the back left. I'm told you're the one who knows where everything is. That'll be useful." Tom Briggs looked at her, recalibrating. "Who told you that?" "Mrs. Calloway. She said you've been here 5 years and you know where everything's hidden, including the things that shouldn't be hidden." Clara held eye contact. "I'd rather have you on my side than the other one." Something shifted in the boy's expression. Not a smile, not yet, but the possibility of one. He went to the back left desk and sat down. The day was hard in the ordinary ways first days are hard, and hard in some specific ways particular to her situation. 2 of the children left at noon and didn't come back. Their parents had clearly made a decision that morning. Clara taught the remaining 12 through the afternoon, and by 3 o'clock she had a general picture of what she was working with. 4 children reading above level, 3 who could barely manage their letters, the rest scattered in between, and Tom Briggs in the back, who was smarter than he was letting on, and had apparently decided to reserve judgment. She walked home in the late afternoon light, and the mountains were doing their amber and shadow thing in the west, and she was tired in a way that felt earned rather than imposed. On Wednesday, one of the 2 children who had left on Monday came back. Clara didn't ask why. She just pointed to the empty desk and kept teaching. It was the end of the first week when Edwin Hale made his move. She had been expecting something. Caleb had said as much, and Clara had spent enough time watching men like Edwin operate in Columbus to understand that they didn't absorb public embarrassment quietly. They waited. They found the angle. They applied pressure where the structure was new and untested. She just hadn't expected it to come through the school board. Mrs. Calloway came to her house on Thursday evening with the particular expression of a woman carrying news she doesn't like. She sat at Clara's table and accepted the offered coffee and held it in both hands and said, without preamble, "Hargrove has filed a petition with the school board." Clara set her own cup down. "Hargrove the lawyer. Edwin Hale's lawyer? Yes." Mrs. Calloway's voice had a controlled quality, the voice of someone being careful not to let anger overtake information. "The petition argues that your circumstances, specifically arriving in Redridge under what he's calling irregular social conditions, make you an unsuitable moral example for the children of the town." The words were so precisely constructed in their cruelty that Clara had to take a moment to simply receive them. "Irregular social conditions," she repeated. "He means the business with Edwin," Mrs. Calloway said. "He's framing it so that you are the one who behaved inappropriately, rather than—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "The board meets in 2 weeks. They'll hear arguments." "Will they remove me?" Mrs. Calloway was quiet for a moment that told Clara the answer wasn't simple. "Franklin Ames is on the board," she said finally. "He's fair. Henry Marsh is fair. The other 2, Stanton and Webb. Stanton has business with Edwin, and Webb follows Stanton as a general rule." She looked at Clara directly. "It depends on what the hearing looks like, whether you have people willing to speak for you." "I've been here 3 weeks," Clara said. "I know." Mrs. Calloway stood and left her coffee cup on the table and said, "I'll be there. Margaret Ellison will be there. I've already spoken to her." She paused at the door. "The children like you, Clara. That matters. That's not nothing." And then she left. Clara sat alone in the 2-room house and did the arithmetic of her situation, which was the same arithmetic she'd done in the spare room at the ranch that first night, updated for current conditions. The difference was that now there were variables that didn't exist 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Calloway, Margaret, Tom Briggs in the back row deciding to reserve judgment, $14 a month, and the slow accumulation of a life that was beginning, just beginning, to have shape. She was not going to let Edwin Hale take this too. She decided that in the time it takes to breathe in and out twice. Then she picked up her cup and finished her coffee and went to bed. She didn't tell Caleb about the school board petition immediately. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment, which was true, but not the complete truth. The complete truth was that she was uncertain what asking for his involvement meant, what it signaled, what it would change between them. They had arrived at something delicate in the last 3 weeks. Not named, not formal, just present the way weather is present, felt without being fully described, and she was cautious about it in a way she couldn't entirely justify. He found out from Margaret Ellison on Friday, which he might have predicted if she'd thought about the speed at which information moved in a 2-mile radius in Redridge. He came to the school just before the afternoon session ended, which she saw through the window, his wagon at the fence, him standing beside it with the reins in his hands, and that particular stillness that meant he was waiting without wanting to appear to be waiting. She finished the lesson and sent the children home and came out to the fence. "You heard," she said. "Margaret told me this morning. I was going to tell you Saturday." He looked at her with an expression that was almost exasperated, which was the most visibly irritated she'd seen him. "Hargrove drafted that petition 2 days ago. The whole town knows." It's my situation to handle, Clara said. I'm not arguing that. He said it quickly, firmly. I know it's yours. I'm not here to... He stopped and restarted. I have something that might be useful to you. That's why I'm here. She waited. He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. When Edwin first started writing you, he said carefully, I didn't know about it. But about a month before you arrived, Wells was drunk at Barclay's saloon and talking about it. He said something about the letters. He paused. I didn't do anything about it then, which I've thought about since. He said the last sentence with the blunt honesty of a man making an admission, no cushion around it. But I remembered what he said, and I told Judge Ames about it the morning after the station. Ames has an affidavit from the bartender at Barclay's, Silas Rourke, confirming that Wells described the letters as a wager, a planned wager. Clara looked at the paper in his hand. Ames kept a copy, Caleb said. He gave me permission to give this to you. For the hearing. He held it out. It establishes that the letters were fraudulent from the beginning. It puts the irregular social conditions back where they belong. Clara took the paper. It was a single page, Judge Ames's hand, precise and formal, the testimony of Silas Rourke dated 3 weeks ago, everything exactly as Caleb had described. She looked at it for a long moment. You went to Ames the morning after the station, she said. Yes. Before you knew if I was staying, before you knew anything about me. He looked at her directly. Yes. She folded the paper along its existing crease and held it carefully and thought about a man who punches someone at a train station and then walks to a judge's office the next morning and gives testimony and keeps a copy and waits for the moment it might be needed and says none of it and waits. Why didn't you tell me about this? She asked. I wasn't sure you'd want it, he said. Some people would rather fight their own ground without documents from someone else's pocket. I'm not going to be insulted by useful information, Clara said. I know that now. She looked at him. The afternoon light was coming from the west, and it was the kind of light that doesn't improve or flatter anything, just illuminates, and in it Caleb Mercer looked exactly like what he was. A man in his early 30s who had suffered something significant and continued anyway, with worn coat elbows and a hat that had lost its shape and eyes that were, in this light, unmistakably kind. Come for supper, Clara said. I have chicken. For Margaret. He blinked slightly, which was his version of visible surprise. All right. It won't be as good as whatever you'd make yourself, she said honestly. That's fine, he said, and the thing near a smile appeared again. The school board hearing happened on a Tuesday, 12 days after Mrs. Calloway's visit. Clara sat at a table at the front of the meeting hall with Mrs. Calloway on her left and the Ames affidavit flat in front of her. Hargrove was at a table to her right, and behind him Edwin Hale sat in the second row with the patient certainty of a man who expects to get what he's paid for. The hall was fuller than Clara had expected. Margaret Ellison was there, and Dorothy Huang from the post office, and Tom Briggs's mother, who gave Clara a look that was not warm but was notably not hostile either. And in the back row, Caleb, who had not told her he was coming and had not asked permission. She saw him when she came in. Their eyes met briefly. He gave her nothing performative, no nod of encouragement, no reassuring expression, just present, there if needed. She turned to face the board. Hargrove made his argument smoothly because smooth was what he was built for. The irregular circumstances, the uncertainty about Clara's character, the importance of moral consistency for the children of Red Ridge. He made it sound reasonable. He was good at making things sound reasonable. Then Mrs. Calloway stood and spoke for 7 minutes without notes. And she was more effective than Hargrove because she was not smooth. She was direct and factual, and slightly angry in a way she wasn't entirely bothering to conceal, and direct factual anger is more convincing to a reasonable person than smooth. Then Clara stood and placed the affidavit before board member Ames, who read it and passed it to Marsh, who read it and passed it to Stanton, who read it with an expression that went through several visible changes in the span of 30 seconds. This establishes, Clara said, that I came to Red Ridge in response to a deliberate deception conducted as a wager by men who are now using their position in this town to damage my ability to earn a living. She kept her voice level. I have been teaching for 6 years. I have a certificate and references. My students have been in their seats every morning since I started, including 2 who came back after missing the first day. She looked at Stanton, then at Webb. I am not the source of the irregular circumstances in this situation. I'm the consequence of them. The hall was quiet. Edwin Hale, in the second row, was looking at a fixed point on the wall above her head. His jaw was tight. The board took 20 minutes. Franklin Ames and Henry Marsh voted to retain her immediately. Stanton took longer. Clara could see him weighing it, could see the actual calculation of his relationship with Edwin against whatever else was moving in him, some older and less convenient sense of how things ought to be. Webb watched Stanton. Stanton voted to retain her. Webb, after a pause that was long enough to be its own statement, did the same. The hall let out a sound, so not a cheer exactly, just the release of held breath from a room full of people, which is its own kind of sound. Clara picked up the affidavit from the table and held it in both hands and breathed. Behind her, she heard Edwin Hale stand. She heard him say something quietly to Hargrove, and then she heard his footsteps on the floor of the hall, and the door, and he was gone. She turned around. Margaret was beaming with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a woman who has been right about something. Mrs. Calloway was already talking to Judge Ames. Tom Briggs's mother caught Clara's eye and gave her a single definitive nod, brief, acknowledging, the nod of a woman updating her assessment, and then moved away. Caleb was still in the back row. He was the only person not moving, the only person in the room not generating noise. Clara walked toward him. "Stanton," she said when she was close enough, "I didn't think he'd vote for me." "Stanton has 2 daughters," Caleb said. "He's had 20 minutes to think about what he's actually voting for." Clara looked at him. "You knew he'd break." "I thought he might." "You could have told me." "I wasn't sure enough to say it." She stood in front of him in the emptying hall with the affidavit in her hand and the mountains visible through the hall's small north window, faint and blue in the late afternoon. "You came," she said. "I said I would," he said, and then she realized she had never asked him, which meant he had simply decided to be there and had come. He had driven 12 miles and sat in the back row and not made a single visible gesture of involvement, had just been there, in the room, in the event, a quiet presence behind her that she had been aware of every minute of the hearing without once looking back at him. "Thank you," she said, for the second time since she'd known him. The first time had been in the doorway of the South End house, and it had meant one thing. This time it meant something adjacent but different, something that had been accruing quietly for weeks, and had no clean name yet, but was real and specific and particular to him. He stood from the bench and picked up his hat from beside him. "The track north of the mill will be muddy tomorrow," he said. She looked at him. "After the rain last night," he added, which was technically true but clearly not the point. "Saturday," she said. "Saturday," he said. They walked out of the meeting hall into the late afternoon, into the cold, clear air, into the ordinary continuing world of Red Ridge, Montana, which was the same world it had been this morning, and also, in some ways that mattered, not. The Saturday after the hearing, Caleb came at 9 in the morning. Clara heard the wagon before she saw it. That sound she had learned to recognize without deciding to, the particular weight and rhythm of his rig on the track north of the mill. She was already in her coat when he pulled up at the fence. He didn't comment on this. She climbed up onto the board seat, and they went to town together, and he loaded his supplies, and she bought flour and lamp oil and a small jar of black pepper that she had been doing without for 2 weeks because she kept forgetting it. And they drove back in the late morning light saying perhaps 40 words between them, which was comfortable in a way that 40 words between 2 people has no right to be. That became the shape of Saturdays. It didn't need to be declared. It just became the thing that happened. She taught through May and into June. The classroom filled back up. By the 5th week, she had all 14 desks occupied again, plus 2 children whose families had moved in from homesteads east of town. Tom Briggs had stopped being careful about showing what he knew, which meant he was now finishing lessons early and making himself a problem in the way that very intelligent bored children do. Clara dealt with this by giving him harder problems, and when he finished those 2, she gave him 3 of the oldest books from the shelf and told him to read them and come back with questions that she couldn't immediately answer. He came back with 4 questions she had to think about overnight. She considered this a reasonable outcome. June brought warmth that actually meant it, the kind that settles into the ground rather than just passing over it, and the kitchen garden at the ranch. She still thought of it as the ranch, still went out there most Sunday afternoons because Caleb needed the fence work finishing and she had nothing pressing. was producing in the way that well-tended ground does when the season finally cooperates. Green things in rows. The manure from behind the barn had done its work. The soil had gone from that exhausted gray to something darker and more willing. The rosebush had put out 7 leaves and 1 small bud. Clara spent a disproportionate amount of time being pleased about this, which she recognized as slightly ridiculous and continued doing anyway. Edwin Hale had gone quiet after the board hearing, which was not the same as gone. Men like Edwin didn't leave the field. They reassigned themselves to other battles and waited for the current one to become less visible. He was still in Redridge, still had money and friends and the particular social gravity that money and long-standing presence create in a small town. Clara saw him twice in the following weeks, once outside Barclays talking to a cattle buyer from Billings, once on horseback on the main road heading south. The first time he looked at her the way a man looks at something he's decided not to address. The second time he didn't look at her at all, which was a more deliberate statement. She found that she minded less than she expected. Not because she had forgiven him, she hadn't, and she didn't feel obligated to, but because what he did or didn't do with his eyes on a road was simply no longer the central fact of her life. He had tried to make her into a story that ended on a train platform. She had declined to let that be the end. That was its own kind of resolution. It was Margaret Ellison who finally said the thing that other people had been arranging their words around for weeks. She arrived on a Wednesday evening with a pie, the visiting with purpose kind, which Clara had come to recognize by now, and sat at the table and asked about the school for 10 minutes, and then put her coffee cup down with the particular deliberateness of a woman who is done with the preamble. "Caleb Mercer drove 6 miles to sit in the back of that meeting hall," Margaret said. Clara met her eyes. "I know. He's driven 12 miles every Saturday for 2 months to take you to town for supplies." Margaret paused. "He could go any day of the week." "I know that too." "I'm not telling you what to do," Margaret said, in the tone of a woman who absolutely is. "I'm telling you what I see because I've known Caleb Mercer for 9 years, and I watched him shut everything down after Ellen and I watched him stay shut for 3 years, and whatever has been happening since April. It's the first time I've seen him look like himself since the winter she died." She picked up her coffee cup again. "That's all I'm saying." Clara looked at her hands on the table. "I don't know what to do with it," she said. It came out more honestly than she intended, but there it was, the plain truth of a woman who had come to this territory following a fabricated letter and had found something she had not been looking for and was not entirely sure how to trust. "You don't have to do anything with it yet," Margaret said. "I'm just saying don't let it sit there turning into something harder to reach." She cut 2 pieces of pie with the efficiency of someone performing a civic duty. "He's not the kind of man who makes speeches. You've probably noticed." "I've noticed," Clara said. "If you wait for Edwin Hale's version of declaration, you'll wait forever." Margaret set a piece of pie in front of Clara. "Caleb expresses himself by fixing things and showing up. That's his language. You have to decide if you can read it." Clara looked at the pie. It was apple, with the particular uneven top crust of someone who had made this 1,000 times and stopped caring about perfection somewhere around the 200th. She thought about a man who had walked past her on a train platform to hit a man who insulted her, who had carried her bag to a wagon and listed his own references to a stranger so she could verify him, who had gone to a judge the morning after and filed testimony and held it in his pocket for 6 weeks against the possibility it would be needed, who came at 9 on Saturdays on the specific pretext of road conditions. "I can read it," she said. Margaret nodded once, satisfied, and ate her pie. The following Saturday, on the wagon back from town, Clara said it. Not planned, or not planned carefully. She had thought about how she would say it and then discarded the planned version somewhere between the dry goods store and the mill, because planned felt wrong, felt like something she'd rehearsed in a mirror, and she had learned from the last time she rehearsed things in mirrors. They were on the north track, the mountains ahead going from blue to green as the afternoon advanced, and Caleb was doing the thing he did on the wagon, where he held the reins loosely and watched the road with the specific attention of a man who is also thinking about something else. And Clara looked at the side of his face for a moment and said, "I'm not going back to Ohio." He glanced at her. "I know. I'm not going back at all," she said. "Not eventually. Not when things settle. This is where I am." She paused. "I wanted you to know that." He looked at the road. "Why?" Because I think you've been careful about... She stopped, reorganized. You've been a friend to me since April, a real one. And I think part of the carefulness has been because you weren't sure if I was going to stay. She was aware of how direct she was being, and she was also aware that with Caleb Mercer, directness was the only tool that worked, that anything indirect would simply disappear into the space between the words without leaving a mark. I'm staying. The wagon went over a rut, and she grabbed the seat edge, and they were both quiet for a moment. All right, he said. She waited. With anyone else, that would have been the end of it, the deflection, the closing off. She had learned enough about him to wait. I know you're staying, he said after a while. I've known for a while. He shifted the reins slightly, a small adjustment. That's not what I've been careful about. What then? She asked. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer, that this was the edge of how far he could go in this particular direction. Then he said, Ellen died in this place, in that house. He said it plainly, the same way he said everything. I stopped being, he found the word carefully, present, for a long time. I was here and I was doing what needed doing, and I was about as present in my own life as a fence post. Clara said nothing. She was learning that his silences were part of the sentence. And then you stepped off that train, he said, with your broken boot and your green dress. And those men were laughing. He looked at the road. And something in me just objected. You punched Porter Wells. I did, he said, which was the beginning of something considerably more complicated. A pause. I'm not saying this well. You're saying it fine, Clara said. He looked at her then, fully, taking his eyes off the road for long enough that it was a decision rather than a glance. I don't want to be careful anymore, he said. About this. About you. The words had a rough quality, like something that had been smoothed in his mind but came out with the edges still on. I don't know what that looks like yet. I'm not the man I was before Ellen died, and I'm also not who I was in the 3 years after. I'm somewhere in between, and I don't have a map for it. Neither do I, Clara said. I came here for a man who didn't exist. I have no experience navigating things that are actually real. She almost said something else and didn't. Then she did. That terrifies me, if I'm being completely honest. After Edwin, the idea of... She pressed her hands flat on her knees, a habit when she needed to stay level. Trusting something is harder than it used to be. I know, he said. But I trust you, she said. I have since approximately the second day. She almost made it a joke and decided not to. That's not nothing. For me, right now, it's actually quite a lot. The wagon rolled on. The mountains were close enough now that they filled the whole horizon, and the afternoon light was coming in low from the west and making everything amber and consequential, the way late light does. Byrne was sitting in the wagon bed behind them and occasionally commenting on things they passed, as was his habit. Caleb reached over and put his hand over hers on the seatboard. Not a gesture, not a performance. Just his hand, which was calloused and large and had fixed 3 fence sections and a window latch, and a porch board, and had once knocked Porter Wells onto a train platform without ceremony, placed over her hand with the same practical certainty he applied to everything. She turned her hand over. They rode the last 2 miles that way without talking, and the silence was not awkward or significant or weighted with implication. It was just 2 people in a wagon at the end of a long spring, on a road they both knew, going north. The summer moved through its weeks the way Montana summers do, with a kind of brightness that feels borrowed, as if the season knows it is operating on a limited loan and intends to be extravagant with the time it has. Clara taught through the end of the school term in July, and the last day was louder than any of the others, the children restless with the particular electricity of imminent freedom, Tom Briggs at the back giving her a look when she dismissed them that was as close to gratitude as a 13-year-old with his defenses still mostly up could manage. Same time in September? He asked, hanging back while the others ran out. Same time in September, she said. He nodded and went. She stood in the empty classroom for a moment with the chalk dust and the uneven desks and the bookshelf that was now significantly more organized than it had been in April, and she felt the particular satisfaction of a thing done well enough. Not perfectly. She'd had 3 bad days and one genuinely terrible one when she'd handled a dispute between 2 of the younger children in exactly the wrong way and known it as she was doing it. Not seamlessly, but done. And the children were better at the end than the beginning, which was the whole point. She was turning off the lamp when she heard the door. It was Edwin Hale. She hadn't seen him up close since the hearing, and for a moment the sight of him produced the old physical response, the tightening in her chest, the adrenaline that 4 months could not completely dissolve. He looked smaller than she remembered. Or perhaps she had simply expanded enough in the intervening months that he now took up the correct amount of space, rather than the outsized amount her fear had assigned him. He stood in the doorway of the classroom with his hat in his hand and said nothing for a moment, and Clara thought, he practiced something on the way here and he's lost it. She waited because she had learned the value of waiting, and because she was not going to make this easier for him. "I heard the term went well," he said finally. Inadequate, and he clearly knew it. "It did," she said. He looked around the classroom. At the desks, the organized bookshelf, the blackboard where the day's last lesson was still written. He looked at these things for slightly longer than the looking required, which told her he was navigating. "What you did," he said. "Writing those letters." He stopped. "What I did," Clara said, and she kept her voice entirely level, "was answer letters, in good faith, from someone I had no reason to distrust." She set the chalk down on the ledge. "You wrote them to win a bet. You wrote them with enough specific detail about your life and this place that they were persuasive. Then you stood on a platform and laughed." She looked at him. "So I think when you say what you did, you mean what I did. And those are different sentences." Edwin's jaw moved. Something in his expression shifted, not into contrition exactly, nothing that neat, but into something more complicated and less comfortable. The expression of a man being made to see himself from an angle he has successfully avoided for years. "I'm not here to make you forgive me," he said. "Good," Clara said. "Because I don't." The word landed between them. She had expected to feel something when she said it, guilt, or the reflexive social discomfort of a woman who has been told her whole life that forgiveness is the gracious response and bitterness is the ugly one. But what she actually felt was simply accurate. It was simply true. She didn't forgive him. She wasn't in the process of forgiving him. She had built a life in the debris of what he'd done, and the life was real in hers, but that was about her capacity, not his deserving. "That's fair," he said quietly. He looked at his hat. He had the expression of a man who arrived wanting something, absolution, resolution, some transaction that would let him refile the event and move on, and was finding that the transaction was not available. "There's talk," he said, "of you and Caleb Mercer." "Is there?" Clara said. "In this town, there's always talk." He paused. "He's a good man. Better than—" He stopped. "He's a good man." It was, Clara thought, probably the most honest thing Edwin Hale had said to another person in years. Possibly the most honest thing that had cost him something. "I know he is," she said. Edwin put his hat back on. He had the look of a man who has attempted something and come up short, and is deciding whether to be diminished by this or simply to leave. He chose, apparently, to leave. He was halfway to the door when Clara said his name. He turned. "The letters," she said. "You wrote about a loneliness, a real-sounding one." She watched his face. "I think you wrote it that well because some part of it was true." The silence that followed was long enough to be its own answer. Edwin Hale stood in the doorway of a schoolroom in Montana with the July afternoon behind him, and for one unguarded moment he looked like something the world had not quite gotten right. Not villainous, not contemptible, just a man who had made a cruelty out of his own emptiness and had to live in the consequences of that, which were also real. Then he left. Clara stood in the classroom alone for a moment. She felt the complicated weight of that. The fact that understanding someone's damage doesn't require you to minimize what they did with it. Both things were true. He had damaged her life deliberately. He was also probably exactly as lonely as he'd written. Those two facts could coexist without canceling each other. She picked up her bag and turned off the lamp. Outside, the afternoon was warm and ordinary, and the mountains were there, as they always were, neither welcoming nor hostile, just present. She had come to find this comforting in a way she could not have explained to anyone who hadn't spent months looking at them. Caleb was at the fence. He had not told her he would be there, and she had not asked him to be. He was there the way he was always there when it mattered. Not with announcement, not with drama, just with the simple fact of his presence in the correct place at the correct time. She came down the school steps and walked to the fence. "Last day," he said. "Last day." She looked at him. "Edwin came to see me." His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes sharpened. "All right. He's not going to be a problem anymore," she said. "Not because he's a better man, just because there's nothing left for him to try." She paused. "I told him I didn't forgive him." "Good," Caleb said, with the simple finality of a man who has no complicated feelings about this. She almost laughed. She did laugh, a little. A brief, real sound, the kind that comes out of relief rather than humor. He looked at her, slightly surprised, and then something in his own face relaxed into a version of it. "Take you somewhere?" he said. "Yes," she said. "But not to town." He looked at her. "I want to see the ranch," she said. "I want to see the garden." Something settled in him, visibly, the way a person settles when they receive a thing they have wanted without quite letting themselves want it. He opened the wagon gate, and she climbed up, and they drove north out of Red Ridge on the main track, past the mill, past the north fence, up the long rise into the valley. The ranch came into view in the late afternoon, same as it always did. The long, low house, the barn, the porch that now had all its boards intact. And the garden, from this distance, was a small green rectangle on the south side of the house, orderly and producing and nothing like the defeated tangle she had found in April. The rose bush, when she walked to it, had 3 open flowers. Pink, slightly uneven, the petals not quite symmetrical. The kind of flowers that come from a plant that has survived things and is not operating from an excess of strength, just from a refusal to be done. She stood looking at them for a moment. Caleb came to stand beside her, which was not a small thing. He had kept a certain physical distance since April, not from coldness, but from the same carefulness he applied to everything he didn't want to damage by moving too fast. He stood beside her now and looked at the rose bush, and she could feel the warmth of him in the cool early evening air. 3 flowers, she said. "It was in bad shape when you found it," he said. "It was under a collapsed fence in broken ground." She looked at it. "It put out leaves anyway, in March, when it had no particular reason to." He was quiet. "I think about that sometimes," she said, "as a general principle." He looked at the side of her face. "Clara." She turned to look at him. "I've been wanting to ask you something," he said, "for about 6 weeks, and I've been finding reasons not to." "What reasons?" "The hearing, the end of term, whether it was too soon." He paused. "Whether you'd want what I want." She waited. "I want you to come back here," he said. "Not temporarily, not as a boarder or a—" He stopped and started again. "I want you to come back to this house as a permanent arrangement." He said it straightforwardly, the way he said everything, but the straightforwardness was costing him something. She could see it. "I'm not good at this. I know that. I don't talk enough, and I work too much, and I forget to say things out loud that I think I've somehow communicated by standing in rooms." He looked at the rosebush rather than her. "But I'd rather be with you than not, and I'd rather say it plainly and be wrong than be careful about it for another 6 weeks. Clara looked at him for a long moment. This was not Edwin's letter. This was not crafted to persuade, not written by someone calculating what she would need to hear. It was imperfect and slightly awkward and entirely him. A man in a worn coat standing next to a rose bush asking a plainly stated question with the emotional vocabulary of someone who had spent 3 years putting everything he had into the functional running of a ranch and was now discovering that he had more left than he thought. "I forget things too," she said. "I get angry and I go too quiet instead of saying what the matter is. I worked 6 years in Columbus and never once asked for more than I was given because I was afraid of being told no." She held his gaze. "I came across the whole country for a lie because I wanted to believe it, which says something about my judgment that I'm still thinking about." She paused. "I'm not what you lost, Caleb. I can't be that. I don't know how to be anyone other than who I am." "I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are," he said, and the simplicity of it, the utter absence of any want for her to perform something she wasn't, was the most convincing argument he could have made. "Then yes," she said. "I'll come back." He looked at her. The thing that wasn't quite a smile, and had lived around the edges of his face all these months, came all the way forward, finally, which changed his whole face in a way she hadn't quite been prepared for. Not handsome in the Edwin Hale sense, nothing glossy about it, just entirely real and present and directed at her. He put his arm around her shoulders, which was also not a performance. It was just the practical gathering of her into the space beside him, where the evening was cold and she was warm, and they were standing in a garden that had come back from nothing, both of them knowing exactly how much that cost and exactly what it was worth. They stood like that for a while, in the garden, with the mountains doing their mountains thing, enormous and permanent and utterly indifferent to human drama, which was, as it turned out, exactly what you needed behind you when you were trying to decide what kind of life to build. Byrne appeared from somewhere around the barn, walked to them, sniffed Clara's boot, and sat down next to her with the air of an animal making a formal decision. He had been giving her one wag every few days since April, escalating slowly. This time he gave her two. Clara looked down at him. "Finally," she said. Byrne looked at the mountains. It was not a perfect evening. The porch still creaked in 3 places even after the new board. Caleb burned the potatoes at supper, which neither of them mentioned until Clara pointed to the pot, and he said, "I saw it," and she said, "When?" And he said, "About 4 minutes too late," and she laughed again, the real kind. The lamp in the kitchen had a wick that needed trimming and threw uneven light, and the mountains outside the window were already dark by 7, the way they went dark fast in summer evenings, without warning. But the table had 2 cups on it, both of them used, and after supper they sat on the porch in the 2 chairs, both chairs, the one that had collected dust and the one beside it, and the air was warm enough that neither of them went in for a coat, and the stars came out over the valley in their layered extravagance, and Byrne settled between the chairs with his customary 2 sighs and went to sleep. Clara thought about where she had been 6 months ago. She thought about the train and the green dress and the broken boot, and the moment she had stepped onto a platform and had the future she thought she was walking toward simply end. She had thought, in that moment, that she had lost everything. She had counted her coins, 2 bags, $11, a teaching certificate in oilskin, and found them insufficient. She had been wrong about the accounting. She had not been counting the right things. She hadn't known yet what the right things were. She knew now. Not all of them. Not with the completeness of someone who has finished a difficult lesson and moved on. But she knew some of them. The value of a person who shows up without announcement. The specific weight of a life built from actual material rather than projected possibility. The difference between a rosebush that looks healthy because it's been handled carefully and a rosebush that's healthy because it survived something it had no business surviving. She knew that trusting yourself after you've been wrong is not a problem that solves itself cleanly. It comes back. In quiet moments, in the seconds before sleep, in the instinctive flinch when something good starts to feel real. She knew she would flinch again. She knew Caleb would go silent at the wrong moment, and she would not handle it well, and they would have to find their way back from it. She knew that Montana winters were long and isolated, and the ranch had a gap under the back door and a stovepipe that needed cleaning twice a year. None of this was the story she had written in that small bedroom in Columbus. That story had been smoother, more certain, drawn in the clean lines of what she thought a life was supposed to look like. This was harder and more irregular and entirely hers. Outside, somewhere in the dark valley, the coyote called. That same ascending note, the one that had kept her company in the spare room on the first night and every night since. She had thought, that first night, that it was asking a question the dark wouldn't answer. She listened to it now and understood it differently. It wasn't a question. It was just a voice, going out into the dark on its own terms, announcing itself to a landscape that didn't answer back, doing it anyway. Doing it anyway. The mountain stood in the dark, patient and enormous. The stars turned slowly overhead, the way they had been turning since long before any of this, and would go on turning long after, indifferent to the small and significant things that happened beneath them. Clara Whitmore sat on a porch in Montana and listened to the night, and the night, for the first time in a long time, sounded like somewhere she lived.